This video is sponsored by Into the AM.
What if I told you that there was a Warhammer 40k faction with some of the coolest models, some fantastic lore, but that the army itself doesn't exist? You'd probably say, yeah Eric, I know, I read the title of the video. You're talking about the Dark Mechanicum. And indeed I am. When you look at the armies of Warhammer 40k, there seems to be a pattern that repeats itself. You have Space Marines and then Chaos Space Marines. You have Imperial Guard, Traitor Imperial Guard. You have the Eldar, and you have the Dark Eldar. Hell, there's even robots and Chaos robots, or at least there used to be. Don't overthink that one. But for some reason, despite the fact that the Cult of the Machine God, the Adeptus Mechanicus, has had its own army for nearly 10 years now, there's no official army for the Dark Mechanicum, their evil Chaos corrupted counterpart. But, as I might have implied, there are plenty of models that lore-wise belong to this faction, and in fact, some of them are really cool. Even though there's no official army for this faction, there might be one day. And if there isn't, I don't really care. I want to collect a Dark Mechanicum army. So let's do it. First off, we need to talk about Vashtor the Archifane. Vashtor the Archifane is a powerful greater demon of Chaos Undivided. A warp entity who's the demonic demigod of inventors, engineers, scientists, and artisans. Vashtor is a pretty new addition to the setting, which has its complications in terms of fitting him nicely into the lore, but it does mean that the official model is pretty bloody cool. And I have one here from the Wrath of the Soulforge King box, so while I put that together, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Vashtor. See, Vashtor gains power from mortals' pursuit of technological innovation, especially inventions that result in widespread destruction or disaster. It's speculated that Vashtor was perhaps born out of a catastrophic arms race that occurred at some point in history, perhaps during the Dark Age of technology, or perhaps during the Necron's biotransference or the creation of the Primaris Space Marines. Or it could be that Vashtor predates those things and his machinations had some influence on them coming to be. It's all very mysterious and vague, which I think is the best way to do lore. Vashtor emerged in Warhammer 40k as the architect of the Arcs of Omen campaign, working together along Abaddon the Despoiler to gather ancient MacGuffins for a massive apocalyptic scheme. Vashtor commands terrifying demon mechanical constructs, corrupts Imperial technology, and wields an unmatched knowledge of the dark sciences. Now, despite being a relatively new addition to the lore, Vashtor obviously fits in really well with the Dark Mechanicum. And the model's really cool, so I decided I wanted him in my army. I started by priming him black, then giving him a hearty white spray from above, leaving some of the shadows in the deepest recesses. Vashtor's body is covered in really cool mechanical bits growing out of his flesh, so the first thing that I did was paint over all of his mechanical bits using a dark metallic color. A lot of the time I don't know what colors I want to paint something when I start painting a model, so the best thing to do in that situation is just paint the things that you do know the color of. Now, in the official art, Vashtor has a brassy gold armor, and that's kind of cool, but I thought black armor would look cooler. So I go back to Vashtor's little armor panels, and I fill in all the panels with black. Now, Chaos models like this with lots of Baroque trim are notoriously difficult and time-consuming to paint. And there's some debate over whether it's quicker to paint the panels and then pick out the trim, or paint the trim and then pick out the panels. Personally, I think it's easier to paint the panels after. If you think about it, the trim has a three-dimensional element to it that makes it tougher to paint cleanly. Vashtor is the Lord of the Forge of Souls, a demonic forge in the realm of chaos that makes all kinds of hideous demon engines and demon weapons. For most of history, Vashtor hasn't ventured out much from this forge, instead preferring to deal with entities that come to visit him. It's only recently in the era Indomitus that his ambitions have caused him to venture out and be seen elsewhere in the galaxy with greater frequency. Since Vashtor was historically a bit of a proverbial shut-in, my plan was to keep a pale skin tone to make him look sort of sickly, as I thought this would fit the sort of introverted intellectual nature of his character and the lean emaciated body that he has. So to do this, I simply washed some thin purple wash over the light undertone. This gives a little bit of lividity to him, but still makes him look quite pale and unhealthy. As a next step, I added a dark wash to all the metal areas, adding both contrast and a little bit more darkness. So as the master of the Forge of Souls, I wanted Vashtor to have a glowing forge light emanating from his mouth and his eyes and other openings in his body. Now, I'm by no means an expert at this effect, but let's give it a go. I started by applying some thinned white paint into his mouth and eyes, letting that seep into the cracks, and when that was dry, I put some fluorescent orange paint on there, and I realized something important. To make a convincing glow effect, contrast is one of the most important aspects. If you want something to look bright, it has to be brighter than the surrounding areas. This is in some sense totally obvious, but what it means for me here is that I need to darken that skin tone if I really want the glowing forge effect to really pop. So I applied some thin dark washes to the skin, gradually darkening the color but not wanting to lose that nice purple undertone. To add some more variation and life, I added some red wash to the areas I wanted to look a bit inflamed, like the contact points between Vashtor's metal bits and his skin. And the effect is pretty subtle when it's dry, but it goes a long way to making him look more interesting and a bit less monochromatic. I started trying to make a glowing effect on his base, but I didn't even really give it a very serious try before changing my mind. I decided I didn't want the base to be competing with a model for attention. I was honestly making a mess of it before I changed my mind too, which made the decision a little bit easier. What I did end up doing was making a mixture of sand, black paint, and modeling paste, which I then slapped onto the base as a texture paste. When that was dry, I used some yellow pigment powder to make a polluted wasteland sort of look, and in a fit of delusion, I tried off camera to apply some thin super glue to set the weathering powder, which is crazy because I know better than that. But it ended up with this sort of chemical spill look that I think is actually pretty cool. And it's an effect I might just replicate in the future. So this is where I left Vashtor, and I think it looks pretty good. They say time passes strangely in the warp, and so I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I actually painted this Vashtor model back in early 2023. You guys wouldn't believe the amount of footage of different stuff that I have filmed and archived just waiting to be either accidentally deleted or made into a video. And you'll never really know unless you subscribe. Looking at it now, my mind sort of alternates between thinking that it's a great and convincing glow effect and thinking that he's just been caught in the act of finishing off an extra large bag of Cheetos to the dome. I don't know. I think now that some time has passed, I continue to improve my painting skills, I might be able to make a more convincing glow effect. But I'm not completely sure, and I always prefer to move forward rather than to go back. I have so many unpainted models that I'm really reluctant to repaint the ones that I have painted, even if there's something I felt like I could do better. Luckily, at the time I painted this Vashtor, I also painted up this Forge Fiend Demon engine in much the same style. Only this one, I'm absolutely sure that I messed up the glow effect. So let's give the Demon engine a second attempt here and see if we can get some convincing forge glow coming from these weapons. But first, let's take a moment to look at today's sponsor, Into the AM. Into the AM is well known for their high quality shirts, and they're now dipping their toe into a new range of stretch denim jeans. I'm wearing them right now, and they feel great, they're comfortable, and they look great too. Made with a 4-way stretch fabric, they won't impede your movement, which is important because you never know when you'll be kidnapped for an underground kumite and have to unleash an arsenal of kicks. Now that hasn't happened to me yet, but you gotta stay ready. Into the AM has become a staple of my own personal wardrobe. You can see here, I got this like cool alchemist guy weighing something out on the scale. Definitely fits my vibes. So yeah, check out Into the AM. They have a great range of high quality clothes and I like them a lot. Use the link in my description to get 10% off today. Thanks Into the AM for sponsoring this video. One of the conspicuous contributions of the Dark Mechanicum to the world of Warhammer 40k are the Demon engines, which currently feature in the Chaos Space Marine armies. These formidable war machines are the result of fusing demonic entities with mechanical constructs, creating a terrifying blend of demon and machine. As I mentioned before, I painted up this Forge Fiend to go with Vashtor, and if there's ever a candidate for a good glow effect, the Forge Fiend is it. These guys are powered by something called a warp fire furnace, which glows with a baleful heat inside the Forge Fiend. Okay, it's time to see if we can get a better glow effect. As you can see, my first attempt was kind of cooked. It's chalky, it looks just kind of orange instead of fiery. So the first thing I'm going to do is break the weapons off the torso so I can have an easier time painting them. They didn't exactly break cleanly, but nobody ever said that making a demon engine was supposed to be a clean and painless process. So with those separate, the first thing I did was paint all the areas that I wanted to be glowing with white paint. Pretty thin. This will take a few layers to build up some proper opacity, but keeping it nice and thin will ensure it stays smooth and not too chalky looking. After a layer or two, I switched to the airbrush, spraying the whole area with even more white. This will make the white look more smooth and more opaque, but also help me to figure out where the glow is going to be. Covering all those inside edges that'll be immediately affected by the glow is going to really help. Now the overspray here got a bit out of control and there was some mess from my last attempt, so I had to go in with some black paint and touch up the areas around everything. This will make sure that there's a really strong contrast when we do the glow effect, and it'll ensure that we're starting from a nice clean slate. I went for a pretty dark metallic color here, mixing in a little bit of black even, because contrast is the name of the game, and every little bit of contrast is going to help, I think. So, switching back to white from the airbrush, I did a final layer of coverage on my white bits, this time carefully controlling the overspray to just where I wanted it. This will be the undercoat for the eventual glow effect, and I don't want it to be too out of control, but the halo effect of this will look really cool if I can pull this off. Fingers crossed. Next, I came in with a brush and painted a mix of fluorescent yellow and orange onto the parts that I wanted to be the brightest and hottest looking. In this case, the plasma coils themselves and the core of the glowing bits. I didn't get any of this color onto the overspray areas, and you'll see why in a second. At this stage, the neon yellow and black scheme actually looks pretty sick. It reminds me of the old Blacktron from LEGO Space. You guys remember those? Those are sick. Anyways, the next step is to switch to fluorescent orange in the airbrush and spray all the edge areas and the white overspray from earlier. You can see already that this gives the weapon the start of the suggestion of like a hot core with the lower intensity orange light glowing beyond it. It's already looking pretty glowy, but we can push this even further to make it look a little less neon and a little more fiery. In the next step, I add a little bit of bright red paint to my orange fluorescent paint, and I hit the glowing areas again, this time focusing only on the areas that I wanted to read as a little bit cooler. So the top of these plasma coils, the outside of the little vents on the torso, and the top of these chimneys on the back. This will give me a nice red hot gradient, which will make everything look fiery. To give the vents on the back the illusion of red hot metal, I dry brushed them with a very dark silver. This will suggest the way that hot metal cools first on its sharpest edges and make the whole thing look pretty red hot. I also dry brushed over the small vents too to contain the little glow a little bit and enhance the contrast. As a final step, I added a tiny dot of white into the center of the areas that I wanted to read as the very hottest parts, then came back with that fluorescent yellow and orange and painted over those bits. Strangely enough, fluorescent actually appears brighter than white to the naked eye, on account of how the pigment bends light from outside the visible spectrum into visible light. That's actually pretty cool. So this is looking very hot. As a last step, I glue this bad boy back together so we can take a look at what we're dealing with. Well, I have to say, this is looking pretty bloody cool. It almost looks like there's LEDs inside. Now obviously this effect isn't perfect. I could have been a little bit more careful with the paint in some areas, but I'm absolutely stoked with how it looks for how quickly it came together. Hell yeah. So we have 2 solid models in the books for my fledgling Dark Mechanicum force, but what else can we add? Well, obviously any army would need infantry, and of course the Skitarii models are an obvious fit, but I wondered if they would look suitably evil if I just painted them black. And while they look cool, they certainly don't look especially evil or Dark Mechanicum-y. Luckily, since I started this project, there's been a huge development, the release of the Mechanicum faction for Horus Heresy. Now for those who don't know, Horus Heresy is a prequel to Warhammer 40k that takes place at the time of the Great Civil War when half the Imperium fell to chaos, and the Mechanicum models released for this are intended to be able to be used both as loyal forces of the Mechanicum and traders who have sworn allegiance to Horus as well. The models are incredible, and I especially like the tech thralls, shambling little dudes who form the core of the infantry for the force. I think these guys will really sit well in a Dark Mechanicum force for Warhammer 40k as well, so I'm going to be using those too. Now, as you might have guessed, this is just the start of this project for me, but in the next installment I'll be adding a ton more to this fledgling force. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring this video, and a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. If you want to help me make this sort of content, consider supporting me on Patreon with the link in the description. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.